This is House Planning Help episode 378. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in building new or retrofitting. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Over the next couple of podcasts, we're going to explore accessibility and inclusion. Today with Guy Harris from AccessiblePRS. He's going to share his own journey, and as a wheelchair user, how did he set about designing his own home? Before we get into our interview, I have a quick favour to ask, and that is, can you write a review for the podcast? We haven't asked for this for a while, but it really does help us, so it's a great way to support what we do if you enjoy our content. And it shouldn't take long. We're just asking for a couple of sentences, sharing what you think it is we do on the podcast and who we're aiming to help. That acts as a signpost and validation to others who are coming across the podcast in different directories. So whatever podcasting app you're using, see if it offers you that opportunity to leave a review. And thank you in advance. Let's get to our featured interview with Guy Harris from AccessiblePRS. We're going to explore accessibility. First up, I asked Guy, where might be a good place to start?
I think we should begin this conversation discussing who accessibility is for. And my opinion of this is that we've got it all back to front. So we make accessibility a burden rather than something that's playful or glorious or liberating for a whole range of people. So we always make it about the person with a disability, which is fundamentally flawed because we bring all our negative stereotypes and misconceptions to that approach. When I tell stories about where accessibility is in place, very often I tell them about people who have no disability at all and show them the advantages so that we can understand that this really is not for some people, this is for all people.
So what are we defining accessibility as?
Okay, God, I love this question. The point of accessibility as a term and adaptability as a term is that we use them in all sorts of ways to mean all sorts of things. So we use these terms interchangeably, and that makes them very confusing terms. I'm focused on wheelchair accessibility, and if you're a wheelchair user, you have specific needs. And just as M42, the old lifetime home standards, and M43 for wheelchair living, if you look at the definitions of them, they talk about accessibility and adaptability. They both use the same words. So it's no wonder that we're confused. For me, accessibility is about the flow and space of a home, the ability to move around it at all stages of life, whether that's parents with young kids, whether it's older people, whether it's wheelchair users, whether it's people who have dementia. Accessibility can mean a lot of things, but it's understanding how we relate to our spaces and our built environments and making them human-centered.
And you mentioned about your needs being in a wheelchair. How do they differ?
I'm a wheelchair user. I had a spinal injury in 2003. And quite simply, in order to be able to be autonomous and independent, I need things to be designed a certain way. So I do need a bit of space. I need to think about how doors are, how wide they are, but also how they're positioned relative to things that come next to them, whether it's cupboards or walls. I need to think about step-free access, and step-free access can include all sorts of things like lifts, ramps, level access. Bathrooms can be a very critical room, arguably the most important room. And by designing for me, you design for any eventuality in life.
Do you mind if we go back to when your life changed? I just feel that it's going to help me understand this topic a bit more and also the journey that you've been on. So what did actually happen and how do you reflect on it today?
Okay, so my spinal injury, stupidity really. I looked the wrong way when I crossed the road and I got smacked by a lorry. So I am very lucky to be here. And the fact that the lorry driver was doing 26 miles an hour coming into a 30 is the reason I am alive. In terms of reflection, like my disability is acquired, like the majority of disabilities are. And that in many ways has given me this really beautiful insight that I was part of the problem before my injury. And I have specific property projects that I was working on that make me understand how I was the problem and how my mentality was the problem. And then after injury and using a wheelchair, I saw all the constant frustrations around property, but that also gave me insight as to the opportunities. So before my accident, I bought a shell apartment in London, and it was about 1,000 square feet, and I asked an architect to deliver some plans for it. I didn't like the plans they delivered, and so I drew a sketch of what I thought, how I thought the space should be divided. And looking back on my accident, I realized that in order to design the most aspirational and indulgent space for this property, what I'd actually done is designed a really wheelchair accessible space. And so I see now that accessibility, we think of it as clinical or institutional. Actually, when you design it right, it's really aspirational. And I know that I wasn't in the wheelchair accessible space because at that time, the Disability Discrimination Act had just come out, and the architect was saying it was about sockets and switches and what height they had to be. And I remember very clearly saying to the guy, look, I don't have a disability. I don't want them at this height. I'm not doing it. So on the one hand, I was willfully not wanting to do anything around disability. But on the other hand, I was designing the perfect space for it. So there was a kind of a nice juxtaposition there.
Was there a stage where you had to put up with properties where you really did see what the challenges were and why all spaces do not work for everybody?
I would say absolutely. I think that until we moved into this space, which we designed, everything was a compromise.
It must be a lot more than that. I feel like you want to lash out almost here. So a compromise, I mean, you're almost living in a different world.
Yeah, God, that's really interesting that you've just picked up on me holding back. I do hold back because I find this subject very frustrating that people don't want to go near it. We build into our environment problems for us, our NHS, our Treasury, our communities, our families all the time. And it's illogical.
But not just build in, it's fixed. You know, what would be your vision for changing it? It would just be so huge.
So I've been thinking about this a lot recently. And actually, before we can go near property, we have to understand our minds. We've been through and are still going through gender equality, Black Lives Matters and Pride, and disabilities like the poor cousin. Our relationship with disability gets a healthy boost every 4 years with the Paralympics. And we saw it in London in 2012, and we absolutely saw it in Paris. Until we get over our subconscious fears around what it means, what it looks like, and not wanting to believe that it can ever happen to us, we're always going to have an issue just with the idea of building accessibly, because they're key words which relate to something we don't want to think about. Either we need to change our relationship with disability, or perhaps we need to change our relationship with the language around accessibility. So I used to use a hashtag for a long while of just good design, because if you look around this home, no one will come into this home and go, wow, look at that accessibility. It really features disability in a wonderful way. You come in and you go, hey, wow, look at this home.
Well, look, this is perfect point to bring this in then and to try and understand, what did you put on the brief for your home?
The architect was amazing, and he wasn't a specialist in disability or accessibility. In fact, I think I was one of his first projects. He drew the brief out of us very carefully about how we lived and how we wanted to live. And so, generally speaking, he pulled a brief out of us in the same way that he would for any other client. That there wasn't a specificity about the wheelchair. As we went, we realized that there were opportunities in discussions we were having. So if you look at the spine wall that goes down the middle of the property, you will see that there are quite a few almost post-like parts of it. And whilst that looks completely natural in the design of the building, and it gives us alcoves and space to put furniture and books and shelves, there are also opportunities for handholds. So for example, if I've just brewed myself a cup of tea and I'm going down to my office, I've only got one hand free. So I can make use of the architecture just to get myself down to the office in an easier way. So they're subtle little things, many of them. When it comes to, say, a room like a bathroom, then yes, we've designed it around a wet room and we've made the space work more easily. But otherwise, it's sensible things like the ground slopes away at the back of the house. And because we extended the old house, or the footprint of the old house out away, we needed to get down quite quickly a level. So obviously we hard landscaped ramps rather than steps. What's been interesting to me is all the opportunities where other people who have no disabilities have come in and used those spaces in ways I couldn't have imagined beforehand, but which is playful or fun or helpful. So I think we do things as we've always done them without questioning. Most humans don't like to question. I seem to have a brain type that loves to question. Often makes life very difficult for myself, but I think we can always do better if we just stop and ask a few questions.
And was it important to you that you build with nice natural materials? How did that come to feature?
That was an evolution. I think we knew we were starting with a blank sheet, and ecological architecture or doing something green was an obvious question to ask, although at that point I really didn't know what it meant. And so we went on a few kind of runs to different places, different people, and they all felt like dead ends. Intuitively, I didn't feel like I was getting what I wanted. And then serendipitously, I heard a sustainability consultant talk at a show. It was a 14-minute slot, and I'd never heard anyone speak so much common sense about how to build. And then she recommended the architect, who was extraordinary. They taught us so much. So the first thing was to take us on a study tour. People make decisions without actually seeing, what they're making decisions on, which is nuts, frankly. And so the more we got to see different things and understand the implications and the benefits and the costs, the more we naturally arrived at the decisions we made.
And can you describe the building if you were walking around the outside, or if you're sitting in here? How would you describe it to someone listening?
Okay, so it's all on one level, but we have a warm roof. So we've got this lovely high internal space, lots of volume. We've got skylights as well as windows, so we've got lots of light coming from different aspects. And the building itself, we've taken what's called a fabric-first approach. And so the outside walls are lovely and thick. They're straw bales. They are used as bricks, so they're load-bearing. That the roof sits on them. And we have a lovely natural clay plaster on the inside, which is stuck straight to the straw. And on the outside, we have this lovely lime render. And so there's a very organic and natural feel, yet you're still looking at straight lines rather than knobbly bobbly. There's just, a few nice curves and subtle colors, and the whole building feels very grounded. It's quite hard to explain, but it's peaceful and it's calm inside. So really we've allied this light and this space and this surrounding of things that feel good. And we arrived at straw, having said the only thing I know I don't want is straw, because we had two very non-tangible experiences. So the first was when in Scotland, we looked at this straw bale building. We went inside. It was blowing a hoolie outside. And I'm paralyzed. I don't feel my legs, but my legs started to tingle in this really warm, cozy, enjoyable way. And I was trying to rationalize it away. So I said to the owner that, have you got the wood burner on? And he said, no, we can't put the wood burner on ever. It gets too hot in here. So I thought, well, looking outside over this incredible vegetable garden, rolled down the hill into the loch below and up the other side. And I thought, maybe I'm just connecting to the land outside. But we went to the property next door, which was a different build. I can't remember if it was hempcrete or limecrete. And actually, in my opinion, a nicer layout, but it just felt cold. It didn't have the same richness to it. So we said to the architect and sustainability consultant, can you show us another property, please? So we went to Haringey Community Centre in London, and my wife was pregnant at the time, about 7 or 8 months, wasn't really enjoying the pregnancy, nauseous, low blood pressure, always moving from side to side. And we were talking to the community centre manager, and she said, let me show you this thing that we were talking about. I can't remember what it was, outside. So we went back outside. What I'd noticed when we were indoors is my wife was standing still and looked actually quite comfortable. As soon as we went outside to look at this thing, she felt nauseous again. Came inside, she felt fine again. And then we ended up having this long conversation with all the people there in an event room, which was completely empty. And she was sitting on the floor, and I hadn't seen her look that comfortable in 7 or 8 months. And so there was no way of understanding what it was, but there were two separate occasions where we both experienced this magical feeling. And so it became a no-brainer. Like we said, okay, don't know what that was, but we're having straw.
Well, I think sometimes you just have to follow your feelings, don't you? So fantastic. Now, how has this behaved as a family home? We've talked a little bit about some of your needs, but of course, it has to do more than that, doesn't it?
Certainly does. It's been a really beautiful family home. And I'm very aware that this is a kind of grand design style building rather than trying to do the most in a much smaller space. So as a family, we do have space. I think that the way we've designed it, it's very open plan for a lot of it. What I've noticed is that we can be together independently or separately, and then separately together. It sounds a bit like the known knowns and unknown knowns and all of that. But it's a really wonderful space because it nurtures what anyone is doing within it. And there's a feeling of connectedness. I also love the fact that with the high space and the high windows at the gable ends, we're connected to the tops of trees, which is a fascinating little psychological thing. And so the indoors and the outdoors and the space and the light, there isn't a clear demarcation of those zones, which means that there's a healthy feel to the home that removes stress. I think one of the subtle things about the house is how when you're in it, everything feels right. And when you feel right, you don't necessarily notice why you feel right. There's just an absence of things going wrong. And it's when I go elsewhere that I really notice all the qualities or features of that design that feel constraining or dark or somehow colder or battling my system. Maybe that I've just sensitized myself or desensitized, I can't remember which way around it is. And that living somewhere really healthy is actually my norm now. And so when I go elsewhere, I really notice that lack that other people aren't noticing.
Well, it's a common thread in a lot of the houses that we cover that they do feel different. What about cost then? Is that one of the challenges? Where do you think you lie on the scale?
Cost is such a good question. And I wish we had more questions about value than cost. You know, if you're only aiming for the minimum cost, like that's a reality. And that means that you will have to make certain decisions. You know, I'm certain that we could have had more space, or we could have built more quickly, and we could have spent less, but that wasn't something I wanted to do. So I think a lot of this is not about the materials you use, it's about how you use those materials. For me, I was taking a long-term approach, like I'm intending to stay here all my life. And so if I mark out that cost over whatever it'll be, you know, 40 years or so, a bit more, a bit less, then I think the cost graduates over that time. One thing I know is that the marriage value between the cost of the build and the cost of the original house and plot, I know that I would get that money back, but I wouldn't necessarily make a large profit. For me, that's acceptable because I wasn't doing this home as a financial investment. I was doing this home as a quality of life investment.
And just broadening back out again to other people who may be building their own homes and wanting to build in accessibility, what do they need to bear in mind?
So the first thing I would say, if you want to design for more people, more possibilities, take advice. Like if you want to, I don't know, have specific sound or acoustic attributes or engineering attributes, you pay for advice. Building and designing homes is an expensive business, no mistake. But it's so easy to make mistakes around accessibility or to spend money on stuff and realize that it doesn't actually meet the mark.
Can we talk about them? What sort of mistakes?
I think about how you have walls and doors and windows in relation to each other, how you how you create the ratios and the space, and think about furniture and what that means, what you need, floor surfaces. Bathrooms are an expensive room. They need designing properly. And a lot of it is really simple stuff. So, for example, if you build a home or a bathroom in a standard way, and maybe you use stud walling, bit of insulation, plasterboard, and a bit of plaster and tiles on the outside, if you need to put a grab rail up, then chances are you're going to have to take all those tiles down, stick in some reinforcement, whatever that looks like, noggins or ply, and then build up the layers again in order that the grab rail has something to fix to. Whereas if you've thought about where wiring spurs need to be, or actually why do you need a 300 nib on a door, or where could a ceiling track hoist go, or those lovely patio doors, sliding doors that you've just put in, when you realize that they don't open all the way. And so whilst you've thought, well, half of the opening is more than a wheelchair's width, you end up with a sliding door that doesn't open all the way. And so it's less than a wheelchair opening width. And then if you want to get out, guess what? You're putting in whole new doors, and that's expensive. And, watching how they put in doors and windows, it's a really invasive process. So anything like that, putting in steps and then realizing, oh, the gradients aren't right, or you could have just done it in a more friendly way, or you've put a ramp in, but you've forgotten that you actually need a level platform at the, on both sides of the door. They're simple things, but they count, they matter. And so paying for a bit of advice, it's surprising how little it costs, but the long-term impact is so significant and cost saving that just one of those mistakes and you've already spent the advice that you could have paid for.
Yeah, at the beginning.
At the beginning is everything.
Life is a lot easier at the beginning. Are there regulations, or you talked about the lifetime homes standard a little while ago, that just make these things a bit easier? It's been done before. We know this.
There are regulations, yes. And for the most part, the regulations are super helpful and very good. But like everything, there are a couple of flaws that I see really commonly. The first is regulations are open to interpretation. And if you have someone, a designer, who doesn't understand the regulations, isn't familiar, doesn't know the intentions behind the regulations, they can interpret them sometimes in extraordinarily bizarre ways that you couldn't make up. And so the regulations, they've been met, but they're meaningless. And the second thing is, regulations for me are about minimum standards. And when we aim for minimum standards, we nearly always fail. So I think the thing with good design is understanding what is it that we actually want and designing for that. Because when we take that advice and we go for, best practice or a deep intention, then the regulations are almost guidelines. I think experience and advice will steer you much further.
Advice from who? Are we looking for a specific profession?
Yes, so there's a National Register of Accessibility Consultants, NRAC, and those are people who specifically have experience about designing for accessibility. The great thing is, like, if you have a designer or an architect that you love, you want to work with, that doesn't stop you working with them. An accessibility consultant can come in at the beginning, at the design phase, be part of those conversations, and they can review designs just to support the architect in optimizing their designs.
And does it help in some way if these consultants have first-hand experience? I know, is that a lot of what you do today?
Yes and no, I would say. Funnily enough, I'm not actually an access consultant. I work with an amazing access consultant where I need it. And that person doesn't have a disability. Funnily enough, I can always, well, I'll give you an example. I went and stayed in a pub B&B and they'd got, vaguely speaking, a wheelchair accessible room with bathroom. At the end of the stay, they said, how was it? Did you have a good stay? And I said, can I ask you a question? Who designed your bathroom in the accessible room? And they said, I think the owner has a friend who's a wheelchair user. And I said, yes, I could tell, because the wheelchair user has designed it for their needs, not for general needs. So I would say I steer clear of design matters because I know what I need and like and want. And that's a preference, just as, I don't know, having a bath or a shower or an open plan or a closed kitchen, they're preferences. And so what an accessibility consultant will give you is best practice design across all needs, so that the designs that you make are as open for everyone as possible. Now, it might be that once you get there, you've got your own opinion on it, and great, it's your own home. So do what works for you. All of this is guidance to support your decision making.
And this is your fundamental message, really, that all buildings should be able to support accessibility.
Well, I think it's common sense. So we're an aging population. By 2040, there'll be more people in the UK age 65 or over than there will be of working age, which to me begs two questions. One, where are they going to live? And two, who's going to look after them? And the only feasible answer at the moment is a kind of neglectful end-of-life care residential setting. And I think that's going to be quite grisly for a lot of people. One of the things that a lot of newly injured people with disabilities say is, they come out of hospital, or they don't come out of hospital for ages because they can't find somewhere to live, and they can't believe there's no accessible accommodation for them. And this is such a kind of oft quoted message that I think that, especially when people are designing their own homes, there's a lot of love and creativity and emotion and hope that goes into designing your own home. And so if you're living in that home and something happens to you, you have a stroke or a disability, and suddenly you not only have to move out of that home because it doesn't meet your needs, but you have to move to somewhere truly awful that doesn't meet your needs, that's kind of grisly.
It's reminded me of a story. I don't know how you're going to react to this one, whether it's a tick box exercise of local developers, but one of the houses on their scheme had to be tick the accessibility box.
Yeah.
And we knew some people that got it because it was nice and spacious. You know, they don't have any disabilities or any need for it. And I think it might have even been discounted because they had to sell it quickly, all these sorts of things. So I don't know what you make of that. I would be interested.
Well, first I'd say great that the builders had to build a home that was accessible, and great that your friends bought it. What I think is interesting, like REBA work stages, it's circular now. The point is the last stage feeds into the first stage, which is about post-occupation evaluation. And for me, there's too little of this happening. I actually think your case study is way more interesting than mine. I'm a wheelchair user. I know my needs. I know why I built this and designed this house this way. But your friends don't have those needs, and yet they've ended up with a house with a bit more space, and there are probably other things, more subtle elements of the design which they really like, but they haven't understood why consciously. So for me, it was far more interesting to show accessibility and then get feedback from people who don't need it on why it's good, because I think that advances the conversation far more than making it about people with disabilities and keeping them as a subgroup or demographic.
Now, maybe we could just start to round off the conversation. You know, have you got any useful advice, perhaps for that person that's had to move into accommodation that is just not good? You know, even just advice on how you deal with that when you can't see the end, but then getting themselves into a better position.
That's a really hard one, because I think very often people who suddenly find themselves needing accessible now, it doesn't exist. And so I think that we treat accessibility as a conversation in its own right. It's almost like we put it, like with all housing issues in the UK, we stick it into a silo. And the silo analogy is really important for me, because we think about affordable homes and we think about green homes, and actually accessibility crosses laterally across all those silos. So I would say, have the conversation in the design meeting. In every design meeting, just ask the questions. What can I do? What if? What does it look like? What does that mean? Have we thought about? Do you know about? And take it from there, because even the simplest of questions will inform the design and make people think. And perhaps I'll leave an example. So the architect who did our home I was working on a community project up in Scotland, and they were building these short-let kind of holiday lets in woods. It was quite a natural project. And the architect said, when he was chatting with these new clients, he had me on his shoulder saying, "What about accessibility?" And they weren't too happy about this because they didn't, young community, they didn't feel they needed it. But anyway, he persisted. And several things happened. The first is that he was designing a sort of modular design. And by designing for accessibility, he realized that making the bathroom worked in terms of size and format actually helped with the modular design. It made things flow. It made it much easier. The second thing he told me was that they had to get from the car park to the homes. And by making it work for a wheelchair user, what they actually did was be able to get the smallest of telehandlers down into the construction area. And so they saved a whole load of time and money. Instead of having to handball all materials off the delivery vehicles, that process went a lot more smoothly. And then the third thing that happened was that dawn broke over the community, and they realized that up until that point, because they were a tight-knit community, if any of them had had an injury or an accident that meant they needed accessibility, they couldn't actually stay in that community. They had to be kicked out because there wasn't a feature for them. Now they realize that whether they swapped homes permanently or temporary while they made adaptations on their own homes, they could always remain as part of that community. And I think this is the point about our homes, is where we're building communities. Communities have always traditionally included everyone. And I think in a healthy sense, we really need to get back to that understanding of what community means at its heart.
Is there a final thought that you'd like to leave us thinking about?
One of the things I would love to do is show beautiful, accessible design, because I think that's where people suddenly start to get it and realize that it's not clinical, institutional, ugly. It's actually something that nourishes and enhances our lives, whether we need it or whether we don't. It's the nourishing quality that I just find beautiful.
Guy, thank you very much.
Great to speak with you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/378, where we have a summary waiting for you if you want to go through some of the main points again. We've got some photos of Guy's straw bale build. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, we give you two options. Either head down to the bottom of the show notes and there's a section there to get interactive, or social media links will link you to Guy and to AccessiblePRS. houseplanninghelp.com/378. My call to action is to check out the hub, particularly if you've never done this before. What do we get up to? Well, it's a further service from us at House Planning Help, a membership community, so we try to bring people together, but we try to learn in a more structured way, because building a house or retrofitting an existing property is quite a job, so there's a lot to take in, so we make it fun, and we have different ways of learning, whether it's the courses, whether it's interacting with others in the forum, or ask the expert. We bring in guests, we've got live training, we have in-depth video case studies so you can get out on site. But the bottom line really is we want you better prepared, and all of this makes more sense in the beginning. When you're halfway through on site, there's not so much we can do at that point. But if it's early days, then check us out, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, architect Stephanie Kyle is my guest as we explore inclusive design. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.